At her home in Bogota, Fanny Gonzalez starts the day with a cup of coffee. She says it's pretty much all she's having for breakfast nowadays.
La dieta cambió.
My diet has changed since this crisis began. I used to have cheese, fruits, and ham for breakfast, but I can't afford that anymore, so all I have now is coffee and bread.
Gonzalez doesn't have a pension, so to cover some expenses, she's dependent on money sent by her daughter who lives in Germany. But that's no longer an option.
My daughter was a babysitter and she lost her job during this pandemic. She used to send me $110 each month, but she can't do that anymore.
Thousands of immigrants in Europe and North America have lost their jobs as lockdowns hurt sectors like domestic work, tourism, and restaurants. Many are no longer able to send money home. According to a recent World Bank report, global remittances will drop by about 20% this year. That trend will wipe out $109 billion from the economies of low and middle income countries.
People's ability to buy food would be impacted, rent places or pay rent would be impacted, sending children to school will be impacted. Maybe more children will have to go and work somewhere, except that it's not clear where they would work under the current circumstances. And equally importantly, this will also make people more vulnerable to the virus risks.
In Colombia, economists say remittances will drop by about $2 billion this year.
We had people who weren't working because they had received money from relatives abroad. As that drops, they might try to get jobs, but it's not clear if the market can absorb them.
Other countries could fare worse. In Nepal, remittances accounted for 28% of GDP last year, while in El Salvador and Honduras, they made up 20%. The World Bank says that the sharp drop in these money transfers could result in people going hungry in some communities.
The problem is more serious in East Africa, Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, in that part of the world, Eritrea, South Sudan, where on top of the crisis, already there was a problem with the locusts.
As remittances drop, low and middle income countries are also expected to lose $200 billion in foreign direct investment this year. That signals tough times for migrants and those at home who depend on them. Manuel Rueda, TRT World, Bogota.
Well, for more, let's go to Andrew Selee in Washington, D.C. He's president of the Migration Policy Institute think tank. Welcome to Money Talks, Andrew. Now, Manuel's story there focused on the effect that a fall in remittances would have on Colombia, but it is dozens of countries around the world who rely heavily on the money that comes from migrant workers. Can you just tell us just how important remittances are for countries like Colombia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and others?
It's absolutely huge. I mean, remittances are, as you heard De La Plata say, I mean, it is one of the most pro-poor investments that happens, people helping their own family members, their own community members. And this is the kind of thing that has pulled people out of poverty in recent years, has lessened inequality in some countries, and we're likely to see an increase in poverty, an increase in young people going to work. And we don't know how long this will last, right? Migrant workers were among the most vulnerable. So people who had moved into childcare, they'd moved into the hospitality industry, or they were in construction, the places that people go when they arrive in a new country, often in the informal market. And these are the people that lost their jobs early on in the pandemic and the economic crisis that ensued. And so we're going to see huge pain around the world in communities where people are used to receiving remittances and staying afloat because of it.
Now, for the countries that rely heavily on remittances, where remittances make up quite a significant chunk of their GDP, are the governments there doing anything to mitigate the impact of this fall in remittances?
It's very hard to see how you do this. I mean, some governments have tried to do, some sort of aid directly to families that are affected by the crisis. But it's very hard to see. One of the things that works about remittances is that they are a strategy of the poor with their own family members to alleviate and get out of poverty. And it's an area that governments have been less effective at supporting. We're seeing, actually, since the story is Colombia, I would say one of the countries that is being most affected by this is Venezuela. 1.6 million Venezuelans live in Colombia, and obviously not only are Colombians out of work and Colombian migrants, but but a lot of those Venezuelans who moved to Colombia and another million or so in Peru and in many millions in other countries are also out of work. And so Venezuela will be a country that will be enormously hit by this, as well as many other countries around the world in East Africa, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere.
And just very quickly, for the migrant workers themselves, who are, many of whom are stranded in these countries without work, I mean, they're having a tough time throughout this crisis, aren't they?
Very much so. And, we've started to see some return migration. People headed back. And the reason is, if you're out of work in a country like Germany or the United States, it's very hard to survive, right? If you don't have a family network, you don't have a community network, it's very hard to survive. And so even though people will be worse off returning back home, at least there's an ability to survive arriving back home with their family. So it's not massive, but it is noticeable to many of the countries that are remittance receivers that some of those people that were sending remittances not only are not sending remittances, but they're actually returning because they just can't afford to be out of work and pay rent and buy food where they were living.
Okay, Andrew Selee from the Migration Policy Institute, thank you so much again for joining us on Money Talks.